presentations we gave you, for the past couple of years, it's been one of the most requested topics. So 2 things to take away here. 1, if you're bored, don't blame me, blame your neighbor. And 2, we really do pay attention to those evaluations. So tell us what you want to hear about next year, and we will try to bring in a speaker who can talk about that. The basics of record keeping. All right, so we need to keep records in 3 general areas: production or performance, operations, and then financial records. And the key to making all of this worthwhile is going to the next step and actually analyzing and doing something with those records. So this is something a lot of people struggle with, myself included. I am great at collecting data and keeping records, not always the best at doing anything with them. I tend to fall in this camp, just make lots and lots of papers. But record keeping can be really worthwhile if we integrate production, operations, and finance and actually do something with them. And hopefully what you'll take away from today is, of course, the importance of record keeping, but maybe some tips and different softwares out there to actually help you take that next step and make your record keeping worthwhile. All right, so we'll talk about production and performance first. We look at production level records on 2 levels: whole herd and individual animal. And in both cases, we're interested in the reproductive performance of the cow and the growth performance of the calf. So now, say you're not taking any sort of records right now. My suggestion is don't dive in too deep at first, because otherwise you get overwhelmed and you say, forget this crap and don't do it anymore. Start with this whole herd level, and then maybe work your way up to individual animal if it works for you and you're interested in having those records. Let's talk about whole herd performance first. The accepted methodology for this is called standardized performance analysis. So most of your different commercial applications are going to use this approach. And really all this does is it lets us compare from herd to herd and puts us all on the same page. And because they have collected so much data using this, they've identified 7 critical measures of herd efficiency using this SPA approach. Now, you don't have to memorize these, but I'm going to quickly run through these just so we all know how I come up with some of these things as I reference them throughout the talk. All right, this first one, adjusted females exposed. All this does is account for the fact that we have cows moving in and out of the herd at different phases of the reproductive cycle. So maybe we're selling open cows, buying some bred heifers, that sort of thing. So this just corrects for that, and we use it when we calculate some of these other things. First one, pregnancy rate. Cows checked pregnant divided by our exposed females. Then we have calving rate. Calves on the ground divided by our exposed females. And then calf death loss. So this doesn't account for stillborns. This is just going to be number of calves that die after birth divided by our live calves. Beyond that, we have our percentage of weaned calves, live calves weaned divided by that exposed females. And this is going to be our primary indicator of reproductive efficiency. Next one, average weaning weight. All right, so this is the most observed measure. But weaning weight by itself doesn't really tell us a whole bunch. So we kind of have to take it a step further. What we really want to know is pounds of weaned calf per cow exposed. And I see some of you frantically writing these things down. I'll post this on our website so you guys can go back to it later. And I'll write that website up there during the break in a little bit. All right, so pounds of weaned calf per cow exposed is our critical measure of herd efficiency. So because they've collected so much data, you see these different benchmarks out there developed by some of these different record-keeping deals. So this particular set of benchmarks is from the CHAPS program. It's an individual record-keeping program hosted by North Dakota State University. And these represent over 90,000 cows exposed from 2008 to 2012. So this is a pretty extensive database. The important thing to remember about benchmarks, they're just an average of operations of all different sizes and different locations. This particular one's mainly going to be North Dakota cattle. Different genetics, management, inputs, all of that stuff. So we don't want to manage to meet a benchmark, but they can be a valuable evaluation tool. So I went to the Farm Financial Database, and for 2013, the last year available, I pulled these SPA benchmark values for producers in the lowest 20% of profitability and producers in the highest 20% of profitability. Now, instead of thinking of these each as the average of a whole bunch of farms, for this example, we're going to think of them each as one farm. And we'll go through how you might use benchmarks as an evaluation tool. So Alfredo can be the low profitability group, and I'll be the high profitability group. All right, so the first one, pregnancy rate. The benchmark is 93%. Well, both Alfredo and I are pretty high. I'm at 98%. That's pretty darn good. Probably not a lot of room for improvement there. Calving rate, we're both above the benchmark, really high as well. So that tells me we're doing a really good job of getting cows bred and maintaining a successful pregnancy, getting calves on the ground. Now, where I see my first red flag is this calf death loss. Alfredo's at 11%, I'm at 8.5%, and that's 2.5 to 3 times higher than the benchmark. I'm going to go ahead and say we probably have a problem there. And that's reflected in our weaning calves rate. So even though we're doing a really good job of getting calves on the ground, we're not weaning as many as the benchmark because we're losing them after birth. Our average weaning weight is lower than the benchmark. I'm really not quite as concerned about that, especially because remember, this is mostly North Dakota cattle. But you'll also notice that our pounds weaned per cow exposed is significantly lower than the benchmark. And this is going to be a combination of your percentage of calves weaned and their weaning weight. And we'll go back to why I keep harping on this in a minute. So for both of us, say we don't have any past records. This is our first year and we're going to use the benchmarks to evaluate ourselves. Alfredo and I are going to go back to our operations and take a real critical look at things. So in Alfredo's case, his facilities suck. Okay, so he's calving in a really small area. His cows are up to their bellies in mud. There's nowhere for these calves to get dry and warm. So he has a lot of death loss because of that. In my case, maybe I've made some investments in my facilities over time. I'm calving in a bigger area, so there's not as much pathogen load. I've built a windbreak. Maybe I put some bedding out when the weather's bad so my calves have somewhere to bed down. But my vet's been telling me I've been skimping on my health program. So maybe Aaron's been coming out for the last couple of years and saying, you know, you're not really deworming as often as you should, or maybe you should invest in a scour guard. And based on this, I'm actually going to listen to you instead of just paying you to come out and talk at me. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and make those investments in our health program. And hopefully what we'll see next year, because we're going to compare these, is that our death loss is going to go down for each of us. Now, at the same time, I also wouldn't be surprised if our weaning weight went up. Because if we have 10% of our calves dying, it's pretty likely that we have a lot of other unhealthy calves that just can't perform to their genetic potential. So we're leaving money on the table because we're not weaning them at the weaning weight we could. So between the two of them, I expect my pounds weaned per cow exposed is going to increase because I fixed these different health problems, or whatever it is on your individual operation. And the reason I keep harping on that is because it's the #1 driver of herd efficiency. And how many of you were here for Eric's talk last year? Okay, we have a couple of repeat customers. You might recognize this slide. I shamelessly stole it from his presentation last year. And Eric did all that analysis of a whole bunch of production measures, and what he found was that this pounds weaned per cow exposed is the #1 driver of profitability. There's a really strong linear relationship between net return per cow and this pounds weaned. So this little R squared thing up here, 1 is the highest R squared value you can have, and that just means a 0.9, there's a really strong relationship between the two of them. All right, moving on to individual animal production. There's a couple different reasons we might want to keep individual records. One could be marketing. So increasingly we have buyers that are interested in receiving more information, down to information on the individual calf. So if we keep individual records, we might open up some value-added marketing channels. Another one would be disease tracking, like we heard about this morning. But for the purposes of our discussion, we're really interested in how individual records can improve management. So our goal is going to be to improve average production of the herd. So we can either improve every cow and calf just a little bit, or we can lop off the whole bottom end of the herd. What do you think is going to move the average more quickly? Remember, I threatened to be interactive. This is one of those times. What do we think?
Lop off the bottom.
Absolutely, but we can only do that if we have information on the individuals. So this data is a little bit dated. It's from the 2008 USDA cow-calf study. What they showed is that 57% of operations representing about 80% of cows, use individual IDs of some sort, mostly ear tags, some other things as well. But only 45% of operations and about 65% of calves have individual IDs. So in order to make this work, your ear tags can't just be earrings and not just for identifying that cow that runs you out of the pasture. We have to track them together in order to identify low-performing animals. So if I have to cull some cows, and they're of similar age, they've produced a calf every year, sound on their feet and legs, they don't try to kill me every time I come in the pasture, how do I decide between them if I don't know what sort of calf they raise each year? So using these individual records is going to help us identify those low-performing cows a lot more quickly. Beyond that, great for choosing replacements, because of course we want to choose replacements from the higher performing cows in our herd in order to move things forward over time. Here's where it gets to be a little bit overwhelming. You have to collect kind of a lot of stuff. These are just some examples, and of course not everyone's going to keep records of the same things. Commercial operators not going to collect the same things as a seed stock operator necessarily. But the main thing is we need an individual ID. Have an idea of the age of that cow, her pedigree or breed if you're using a crossbreeding system are good. Another big one is your management, vaccinations, health procedures, that sort of thing. So we gotta look at these over time. So say I'm looking back to 2011 and I see that year sticks out, something was different. Do people in here remember exactly what they used for their vaccinations back in 2011? Probably not. Okay, we have a couple. You guys have a lot better memories than I do. I don't remember what I had for lunch a couple days ago. Well, it's written down, okay, but I mean like off the top of your head. If you're not keeping any sort of records, you probably aren't going to remember that. All right, so the other things we need to know: who she was mated to, preg test results, information on our calf, all of that stuff. And what we can look at on the individual level is the reproductive history of that cow, her calving interval, and another one is weaning weight to cow weight ratio. Okay, so this might sound a little bit weird. How many people even weigh their cows? Probably not very many. A couple. And it's not necessary, but if you find your cow herd getting bigger and bigger over time, this can be a good gut check. So a bigger cow, up to a certain point, is going to wean a heavier calf. But there's a plateau in that weaning weight. As those cows continue to get bigger, their maintenance requirements go up as well. They're going to eat more. No longer as efficient, and now your operational expenses are getting out of hand without any additional profit out of that. So if you find your cow herd slowly getting bigger, it'd be worthwhile to go ahead and weigh your cows one year and just kind of get an idea of what things look like. Maybe go back to the drawing board in terms of genetics to get down to a more moderate level. All right, so moving on to the calf. Again, the number one thing is that individual ID. We want to know when they're born, sex, again, this management stuff. Did I crete feed? Did I put an implant in them this year? That sort of thing. Performance-wise, we're interested in birth weight and weaning weight. And then if you retain ownership or have access, I almost made a mess, access to data further on, that can be really valuable. Yearling weight, carcass data, that sort of thing. And making genetic improvements, they can drive your selection. Things we might be interested in on the individual calf level. Weaning weight ratio. So that's the average or the weaning weight of an individual calf divided by the average of the calf crop that year. But we're usually going to separate those into sex groups. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to compare our heifers directly to our steers or our bulls. We can do the same thing with yearling weight ratio, and this just helps us identify outliers a little bit easier. And finally, weight per day of age. Right? So if we have a long calving season, looking at weaning weight by itself doesn't necessarily tell us a whole lot. It may seem like an individual cow produces a big calf every year, but it might be that she's just an early breeder, which is a valuable trait in and of itself, but it doesn't give us the whole picture. So we just take weaning weight divided by day of age, put them on a level playing field. Gives us a little bit better idea. And this is just meant to be an example that it sounds like a lot of stuff, but individual record keeping doesn't have to be that complicated, especially if you're already doing stuff on a whole herd level. And there's a lot of different softwares that are available out there. So if you're really into Excel and have the time to set that up, that's great. Not all of us can do that or have the desire to. So there are some different ones out there. This is just a small example. Two pretty popular ones are CattleMax. I've used that one. And then CHAPS, that one out of North Dakota State. Whole bunch of other ones. And Oklahoma State University Extension actually maintains a document that goes in insane amounts of details about what all these different programs do, what you can record with them, what sort of analyses they run for you. One thing I like about CattleMax, and other ones do this as well, you input all your records and you click a button, it does a lot of these analyses I talked about for you and makes pretty graphs and that sort of thing. Most all of them take this SPA approach, that standard methodology. Some of them have mobile options, and basically all of them have free demos. They'll let you use the full thing for 30 or 60 days, and I strongly recommend that if you're going to go ahead and buy one of these softwares, and don't just click through it a couple times and say this one's good. Sit down, enter some records, make sure it's something you're actually going to use. And what's the best data collection method? Well, it's the one that you are going to use.